No? Yeah, it is. Okay. I know that I heard a couple of churches change their VBS to this week. So not that that's any reason why they didn't, we didn't have a better turnout, but I think we had a pretty good turnout. It's all about the one, right? Not the many. So thank you to Don and James. Is James here? He went out? Well, then I can't say thank you to him. And Nathan and now Mackenzie. I really appreciate them, and I hope you guys learned something from them, because the little bit that I was in here so far, it's been some pretty good stuff. So I really appreciate what you guys did. So really, it's just thank you to Don, because, I see Nathan back there. Quit trying to hide. He is going to be speaking about the sonic boom, and really a lot of it has to do with the fear of God. So I want you to, or the fear of the Lord. So a lot of those things, those fears that we have, can tend to keep us and prevent us from doing what we're supposed to be doing. And I'll tell you one little story I've been thinking about lately is we really have two selves. We have this, and I'm not trying to compare this to it, but it's very similar to something like bipolar. It's a disorder, right? We all have this idea of, this is my Christian self, this is who I am when everybody's looking, right? But this is who I really am when nobody else is looking, when none of you are looking, right? Because I can act a different way when nobody's looking at me, when nobody sees me, nobody sees who I am or what I really am. And that's where we have to get, I think, away from, is not letting that fear. Many of you know that I have a really bad fear of speaking in front of people, right? I've learned to overcome it. I think I do a lot better job with it. I didn't prepare anything, and I'm actually speaking to you, so that, to me, says I'm doing some good stuff, right? We oftentimes take our Christian selves and put it in our pocket when we leave. We leave this building, that's it. And so we use the outside world as this crutch. It's a fear of being able to go out there and really speak that word that we know and hear. What are some things that you think that we're afraid of? Anybody got any ideas, questions, thoughts? Name a fear. Rejection? Absolutely. Big one, right? We're all afraid that rejection will lead to a loss of friendship, a loss of family, loved ones. I think the biggest fear, though, is that we might lose them forever. And that's what our fear needs to come into, is saying, I'm so scared that I think I might lose that person, that they might not enter the kingdom of heaven one day. That's our fear. That momentary loss of a friend, that momentary lapse in reality for them, is they're so angry and they're so caught up in that idea that maybe they're not mad at me, maybe they're mad at themselves, right? So many times we pass by a lot of opportunities that we take to help somebody, that we stop on the side of a road to help somebody and they're in need. What are we afraid of? Why don't we do that? Hmm? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And in today's society, we are. Back then, we wouldn't think that somebody's going to jump out of the bushes, a whole team of people, and take us and sell us or something. I don't know. Kidnap us, ask for money, ransom, things like that. All those things of the world go into play. Like the story we just heard about Nate Saint. That story is something that, when I was reading through this stuff, I didn't really think much of it. But the more you think about it, you kind of have to say, are we really like that? Are we really ready to put ourselves into the unknown? And now that Mackenzie's looking at me, there's a lot of fear that I have. He made it. So one last thing on it, we say we're going to go on missions, but we choose not to go on missions because we're afraid of where we go to. We just went to Guadalajara, and the whole time all I felt was fear. You see National Guard trucks with people with machine guns driving around, and you're waiting for the cartel to come and shoot you. And we never felt that. Come to find out, the Christians, they leave alone. People that are religious, the cartel oftentimes leaves them alone. They don't bother with them because you don't do that. They don't mind doing anything else, but the reality is we get into that fear of what's going to happen, the unknown, all those things that keep us from doing these things. You got to step out of your comfort zone and really understand that the only fear is your fear, and it's your worldly self holding on to that fear. You got to let go of it. You really got to take your Christian self and put it forward. Okay, so that's all I want to say. You could pick it up, please. Oh, no.
Thanks for waiting on me.
Well, I was trying to keep people occupied.
I just flew in from Dallas, and boy, are my arms tired. It's pretty good. All right. It was a total dad joke. Good to be with y'all on this last night of VBS. If you'd like to go ahead and turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4. Tonight we're going to talk about finishing well, what it means to finish well. And in 2 Timothy 4, Paul is writing this letter to Timothy, and it's almost like he is setting up a discussion and giving his last words to Timothy, his famous last words. And I captured, just preparing for this, I captured some famous last words that I thought were interesting. Captain Bucky O'Neill in 1898 said his famous last words. They were, "Sergeant, the Spanish bullet isn't made that will kill me." And that was just before being shot in the mouth prior to charging up Kettle Hill. That was his famous last words. Nostradamus predicted in his famous last words, "Tomorrow at sunrise I shall no longer be here." And he was right that time. He was finally right when he said that. Richard B. Mellon, a multimillionaire, was the president of Alcoa, and he and his brother Andrew had a game of tag going for about 7 decades. For 70 years, they played tag with each other. And when Richard was on his deathbed, he called his brother over and whispered, "Last tag," and Andrew, his brother, remained it for 4 years until he died. That was his famous last words. Johnny Ace was an R&B singer. Does anybody know who Johnny Ace is? Jimmy, you don't know? He was an older R&B singer. I thought you might know. Okay. 1954, he died while playing with a pistol during a break in his concert set. His last words were, "I'll show you that it won't shoot." That was his last words, apparently. Murderer James W. Rogers was put in front of a firing squad in Utah and asked if he had a last request, and his last request was, "Bring me a bulletproof vest." I don't think they supplied him with it. Convicted murderer Thomas J. Grasso used his last words to complain about his last meal. He said, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti, and I want the press to know this." So that was his famous last words. Groucho Marx, I know you know who Groucho Marx is, Jimmy. Okay. Groucho Marx probably has my favorite one. In his last words when he was dying, he said, "This is no way to live." So he died. I thought that was pretty good. So tonight we'll look at famous last words and what it means to have our famous last words. You know, what do we want our last words to be while we're here on earth? Is it something that we would be ashamed of? Is it something we would be proud of? You know, is it one last prayer whispered on our deathbed to our Father through His Son? What what does it mean? Paul, in his letter to 2 Timothy, chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, he said, I'm going to back up to verse 6. He said, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." What a great set. Now, it wasn't his official last words, but if those were our last words, that would be a great thing to leave as you think about leaving this world. Paul uttered those words with great confidence, and as he should. Paul sacrificed so much. He sacrificed a worldly life. Before his road to Damascus, Paul lived a pretty well life, was set up pretty well, but he sacrificed all of it. And here he implies that he's nearing the end of his life. He tells us he's nearing the end of his life, and he's excited that he finished well, right? Something that would do well for us to be in a position in. I love the way that Paul phrases this too, because he points out that finishing strong. Okay, that's planned. Right? Okay. He points out that really caught me off guard. He points out that finishing strong is not a sprint. It's not something you're just going to race hard through, and go a couple of weeks and then you're done, right? To him, finishing strong meant running a marathon. And the way that we live our life here, we know it's all in the same way. We have ups and downs in our life. We have struggles that we go through, but it's something that we work on our stamina, we work on our faith, and we try to do well. So tonight I want to talk about a few different topics that we can pull out of this. The first one is what it means to fight the good fight. Paul's using that analogy. He's using the analogy of fighting and boxing, and he's using the analogy of running a race. So you kind of get this give and take in how he describes it. Boxing is brutal now, but boxing was even more brutal then. The way that the Romans held boxing matches is essentially whoever the winner is the one that can still get up and breathe and move around. That's a lot of how their boxing happened then. Who has actually been to a boxing match? Has anybody been to a Cindy has been to a boxing match. Calvert? Okay. I went to my first one, I guess it was last year. A lot of you know that Drew boxes, and it helps him with his Parkinson's. It strengthens his core. He doesn't actually fight people and punch them in the face. We did a lot of that growing up, but he doesn't do that anymore. But some of the folks that he trains with to try to strengthen his core and his balance, they are professional boxers. And one day he hit me up and asked me if I wanted to go watch one of his friends from the gym box. And it was in the Birmingham area. I was like, yeah, that'd be interesting. So we went and we sat really close to the ring, and it wasn't a situation where I thought too much about it, and I sit down and I'm watching these men just hit each other in the face. And you watch it on TV, and you watch it in the movies, and it doesn't seem that real, but when you're sitting, watching them, they are really hitting themselves in the face, each other in the face. And it's a brutal sport, and that's how life is in a lot of ways. Sometimes we get hit in the face, and it's hard to get back up. Speaking of boxers, one of Mike Tyson's best quotes ever, he has a ton of them, but one of his best quotes ever is, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face." That was Mike Tyson's famous quote. But that's a lot of how life is. And sometimes we are able to get up and battle on, and sometimes sin just knocks us out. There's a couple of examples of this. I think one of the best examples is thinking about discouragement and what discouragement means to us a lot of times. Discouragement is one of those situations, especially when you're discouraged in your Christian life, it's one of those situations where you truly get knocked down, and it's on you to get back up, right? With the help of God and His Word, and with the help of your brothers and sisters, if you're active in the church, you can do that. But every single one of us get discouraged. In Numbers 13, we read about the Israelites going into the land of promise, and what happens? They get discouraged. I haven't been here all week, so I don't know if Tim has led 10 saw bad and 2 saw good yet. It's one of my favorite VBS songs that we do here at Asheville Road, and it's about the 12 spies that go into Canaan. And what was the reason why the 10 spies came back and said, we ought not to do this? Fear, right? They really came in as part of God's people. They went into the land of promise, and they looked around, and they got discouraged. That's essentially what happened to them. Were it not for Joshua and Caleb, they would have been knocked out for sure. Ultimately, the Israelites took the land of Canaan, but it took a while to get back up. There's 4 main reasons why they were so discouraged. One of the first reason is they lost their dependency. They lost who they were supposed to be dependent upon. Were no longer, it's like when they crossed over into the land of Canaan, they decided they were no longer going to be dependent upon God, and they made their mind up to be dependent upon men. And so when they looked at big giants, they didn't look behind them and see God standing behind them. They looked forward, and they realized, we can't take these people on our own, and they were right. So that was one of the first things that made it really hard for them to get back up. The second thing is they listened to the many, but not the few. That's such a big lesson for us, because if we look around, the world that we live in today, and we listen to the many, we listen to the masses, we are certainly going to be discouraged. It's the few that carry the gospel message, that are on this walk with us, that we should be listening to. There are so many voices in this world, and we can't get confused as to who we need to be listening to. The third thing, they heeded the bad news and not the good news. It was one of those good news, bad news situations. When somebody comes up to you and they say, I've got good news and I got bad news, what do you want to hear first? What do you always say? I always say I want the bad news first. They got both, and they only paid attention to the bad news. And we can do that a lot of times in our life. We can really focus on the bad, never focus on the good, and the good is what pulls you up, right, when you get knocked down. The last thing is they responded in fear and not in courage. I want to flip over to Numbers 13 and just read verse 20 out of Numbers 13. It reads, "And whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not, be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. And then they went out and spied out the land." This was a commandment that Moses had given to them, that they were to look around and be courageous and spy out the land. They knew there were enemies in the land, but they had lost their courage and turned to their fear. Ultimately, because of Joshua and Caleb, because of Moses' leadership, they were able to go into the land of Canaan and take it over. So they were able to get back up as a people, but it wasn't without a lot of folks that had to be left behind. So they eventually got back up. I think one of the best examples of getting knocked down and getting knocked out is the lesson that we get when we look at the story of Judas. A great and direct passage around this is what we read about Judas in Luke 22, verse 3. We see a man who ultimately was completely knocked out. In verse 3 it says, "Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. So there's a lot of foreshadowing here that we see about Judas. Jesus talking about a betrayer being among them. And we see in verse 3 here that Satan had entered into Judas's heart. He hadn't passed on yet. He hadn't hung himself in shame yet, throwing down shekels of silver and giving all that up. He hadn't reached that point, but he had been knocked out, right? He had opened his heart up to the wrong things. He had ultimately given up. And so that's one of the first things that we have to remember is what it really means to fight the good fight, the things that we have to look out for. And I think those two examples are great examples of things that we have to be careful about. The next thing Paul talks about in 2 Timothy is finishing the race. We truly have to think about how we move through this life as a marathon. This is a day-to-day, hour-by-hour race that we're in. I've never ran a marathon for obvious reasons. Some people have ran marathons and it doesn't make sense to me. But I've never ran a marathon for obvious reasons. But I have ran some long distances, nowhere close to a marathon. And once you get into it, in my mind at least, it is, you're living one step at a time when you're in this long distance run. It's something that you're just striving for, you're trying to get through. In a lot of ways, that's how it is to live this Christian life. We cling to our Christianity, we cling to our walk in the light with our brothers and sisters. Look at what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 12 in the first part. The Hebrew writer just finishes writing about what we call the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, and he's transitioning in chapter 12, and he points out to everyone, he says, since we're surrounded by all these people, all of these great people, he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. And then look at what he says. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Some people even run with like weighted vests and weighted ankles around them. They really go too far with it. But look at what the Hebrew writer says. He says, lay aside every weight, lay aside everything that's weighing you down, and run the race that is set before you. And we can see what kind of race it is in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. He says, run it with endurance, the race that is set before us. This is not something that you're going to get through one day and be able to be done with. In a lot of ways, that's one of the reasons why we look to heaven. It's one of the reasons we have hope in heaven and salvation is the race that we run here is not a short and easy race. It's a hard and long race. We lose loved ones. We go through disappointments in our own way, and that's part of the way that we need to look at this. We have to put everything aside that weighs us down, no matter what it is, and focus on the things ahead. Philippians 3, verse 13 says, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, the writer says, run it with endurance. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 13, Paul says, straining forward to what lies ahead. You see the words that these writers in the New Testament are using, endurance and straining. This is not a race that is easy for everyone. It is a narrow path. We see what happens with Judas. Satan enters into his heart. In Luke 22:3, we read about that. In Matthew 27:5, Judas gives up the race entirely. He ultimately gives into the way to sin and gives up the race, throwing down his silver treasure and hanging himself. It's a long, hard race that we have to run, but it's set before us. And the good news is we're not alone as we run the race. Paul also says, keep the faith. How did Paul keep the faith? What did he do? One of the things that he did is he was continually on guard. You can see some of the things that he did. He even talked about life. I think that's one of the reasons Paul, a lot of Paul's writings are just logical writings, kind of if I live this way, this is going to happen, or, the temptation of the flesh. He talks a lot about, flesh overtaking and his continual fight against it. You kind of see Paul continually being on guard against those things that he needs to be on guard. In the Greek, the word keep, as it pertains to keeping the faith, includes guarding over, protecting your faith, protecting your belief system. Look at some of the experiences that Paul had in all of his sufferings. You remember the list in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 33? I get exhausted just reading it. I didn't live it like Paul, but he lists out all the things that he had to experience. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. We don't know specifically what that is, but we do know this: it humbled him. It brought him to a low spot in his life. And in a way, I feel like Paul saw it as a blessing. It was a means by which he was able to guard himself. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15, Paul talks about being abandoned in prison. He had been through so much in his life, and he was able to guard his faith, keep his faith as he lived such a hard life. And all these things, Paul persevered. Look at all that happened in the latter part of Acts. Paul starts in the first part of Acts. We learned about it this week. But Paul starts in the first part of Acts, persecuting Christians, dragging people out of their homes, bringing soldiers to Christians' homes. And if you look at Acts chapter 22, if you look at Acts chapter 25, what do we see Paul doing? We see him standing before kings. We see him standing before councils. And what is he doing? He's defending the Christian faith. He's telling his story. He's giving his own testimony. And he's talking about all the things that he's persevered because of his love for Christ and his love for Christians. And you see such a big difference in the way that Paul lays that out. So keep those things in mind. Fighting the good fight, finishing the race, keeping the faith. Last of all, though, how do we know we're on the right path? How do we know for sure that our labor is not in vain? You may be miserable here on earth, so you may be listening to tonight and saying, well, Mackenzie, I'm checking all the boxes because I'm miserable, right? But you could still be on the wrong path. You could be miserably on the wrong path. The goal is not to be miserable. The goal is to be a Christian, right? So how do we know that we're working and doing the things and on the right path? J.C. Ryle wrote about the 3 looks at Jesus. And this is what he said. He said, peace is looking back at the cross of Jesus, leaving this world behind. Death is a victory in that scenario. Resurrection is the victory. So peace is looking back at the cross of Jesus. He said, looking upward to Jesus' intercession for us is a second look at Jesus. So Jesus speaking on our behalf to the Father, standing in our place, because the Father can't accept anything but pure righteousness, and we don't have that. So Jesus has pure righteousness and can go into the presence of God and speak on our behalf. So he cited that as the second look at Jesus, his intercession for us, him standing in the place for us. The third, he said, looking forward to Jesus coming back again. Being able to look continually for Jesus to be with us, praying that Jesus comes soon. Do you ever pray for that Jesus comes soon? That was the three looks. So I want to talk through those briefly, and then we'll close out. First of all, looking backward, looking back at the cross of Jesus, we see Paul welcoming death. That's another thing about Paul that we didn't talk about yet. But Paul was this crazy person who welcomed death. Look at Philippians chapter 1. Let's flip over to Philippians. Philippians chapter 1, and I'm going to read verse 23. This is Paul talking about living and dying, and he redefines living and dying a little bit for us through this section. But in verse 23 he says, I am hard pressed between the two, living and dying. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. How often do you think about that? That's Paul looking at the cross. That's Paul looking at Jesus and wanting to be with Jesus, wanting to be with our Father. If we have that type of vision, if we're continually looking back at what Jesus did for us, looking at the cross of Jesus, that's a really good indicator that we may be on the right path as we work through this life here on earth. What about Jesus' intercession for us? I talked about Jesus' perfection this quarter in the 5th and 6th grade class, which is a lot of fun to teach. I'm teaching Drew's book on Christian hope. And one of the things that Drew does in his book on Christian hope is he defines hope as a subpart in our definition of faith. He explains that hope itself is something that you could use to help define faith. And what he says about hope is it is the forward-looking part of faith. So he explains that there's multiple parts to understanding faith. Hope is one of them. It's the forward part of looking at faith and having faith. So our faith is a strong component, or hope is a strong component, and it's all built on Jesus, His perfect life, and one of the biggest parts of that recipe for hope is His willingness to die on the cross for us. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 gives us a good basis for understanding hope and what it means. It reads, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to His great mercy, He has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So all those things have to fall in place. The resurrection of Christ, the victory of Jesus over death, and then we also have to be born again. So we have to go through that process of being born again, and the resurrection of Jesus is what creates that living hope. Drew also talks about 3 assurances, 3 things that we can use to know that we have this hope. He talks about the empty tomb. That's one way that we know we have hope in Jesus, in the resurrection of Jesus. The tomb was completely empty. We actually talked about that some this past Sunday with the 5th and 6th graders. It was not the Jewish custom to actually take a crucified person and put them in the tomb, right? Remember, Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate and said, "Can I have his body? Can we put him in a tomb?" And it was a long burial process once it got to that, got through those pieces. But what his disciples found is that his tomb was empty, and that into itself gives us assurance. All the appearances Jesus made post-resurrection, that gives us hope, right? It's something that we can count on. Christianity itself and the amazing life that is led by the Christian and the origins of Christianity gives us hope. It builds faith itself. So I've always loved that. I thought that was a good way to think about, what creates assurance, what gives us blessed assurance. Because assurance is something that we're blessed with. Hope is something we're blessed with. So the fact that Jesus intercedes on our behalf with the Father brings us into communion with God. That gives us hope. The last point, and then we'll close out. I don't even know, Bob, what time we're supposed to close out. Well, you're in charge of VBS. Oh, okay. So we may wrap just a little early. The last point is looking forward to Christ. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. Paul again is talking here, and he says, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. In his words to Timothy that we read earlier, this is how Paul closes all of those pieces out in this passage. And he uses the phrase, the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me that day. You can see what Paul is looking forward to, right? He wasn't looking forward to retirement. As much as we love, or you all, love your grandchildren. I don't have any grandchildren. But as much as you love them, that's not something that Paul was writing about here. Paul was writing about being able to look to the ultimate judgment, being able to look to Christ and being with Christ one day. So Paul knew that he was just a heartbeat away from being with the Lord, and his motive, his drive, was keeping his eyes on Jesus and looking continually forward to that. All right, and I think that closes us out for this week. So hopefully you can take some of those words about famous last words about finishing well and apply that to your life. Thanks for letting me come in a little late. Bob, thanks for talking about whatever it was you were talking about. And we'll close out. Thank y'all.